She received a house that nobody could see because it was buried under 100 years of dirt. Everyone had forgotten about it except the lawyers, who laughed at her for taking it. But when single mom Sarah Coleman started digging with just borrowed shovels and nothing but hope, what she found under all that dirt wasn't just a house. It was a secret that would change her from the poorest person in town to the most powerful. She discovered something worth $15 million that someone had buried and hidden away. Before we start this amazing story, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story that will blow your mind. The morning Sarah Coleman got the letter about her inheritance. She was counting coins at her kitchen table. $23.47. That's all the money she had before she would lose her apartment. Her daughter Emma, who was only 7 years old, sat across from her, carefully coloring a princess castle, while her mother tried not to cry. The letter came from a law office 3 states away. The paper was thick and fancy, feeling expensive in her rough hands. Her great-aunt Millicent, who she had never met, had died and left her something. Sarah's hands shook as she read it. Not money, not jewelry, a house. But there was a problem. The house was buried. Actually buried under many years of dirt after a mudslide in 1924. The lawyers actually laughed on the phone when they called to make sure she understood. It's more like a dirt hill at this point, one lawyer said. The land itself is worthless. There's no road to get there. You'd be getting a tax bill, really. Sarah hung up and stared at the papers. A buried house. Even luck seemed to be making fun of her now. But she was 32 years old, working 3 jobs, and still couldn't pay for electricity. Her ex-husband had left her with nothing but bills, and a daughter who deserved better than peanut butter sandwiches for dinner every night. What did she have to lose? She called back. I'll take it. The lawyer stopped talking. Are you sure? There's nothing there but a hill of dirt. The county papers say there's a house underneath, Sarah said. I'll take it. The silence on the phone lasted so long she thought they hung up. Finally. All right, Miss Coleman. The property is yours. 3 days later, Sarah stood at the edge of what looked like a normal hillside in the countryside of North Carolina. Emma held her hand tight, eyes wide. The land looked exactly as they described. A gentle slope covered in wild grass and young trees. You would never guess a house was underneath. The closest neighbor was a mile away, and the dirt road to get here was barely a trail. Mama, where's the house? Emma asked. Sarah knelt next to her daughter, pointing at the hill. It's sleeping under there, baby. Like buried treasure. Emma's face brightened. Can we wake it up? Sarah felt something change inside her. Not quite hope, but close to it. Yeah, she whispered. Let's wake it up. The first person she asked for help was Marcus, who owned the hardware store where she worked on weekends. He looked at her like she was crazy. You want to borrow shovels to dig up a house that's been buried for 100 years? She nodded. He shook his head, but gave her 2 shovels anyway. Bring them back when you realize this is crazy. But news travels fast in small towns. By the time Sarah went back to the hill that evening, half the town had heard about the single mother trying to dig up a buried house with hand tools. They drove by slowly with their windows down, shaking their heads. Some laughed. Some took pictures. At the grocery store where she worked at night, her co-workers whispered behind her back. Poor Sarah, like she didn't have enough problems already. She inherited dirt. She literally inherited dirt. Even her own mother called, her voice tight with disapproval. Sarah, honey, you need to focus on real solutions, not fairy tales. But Sarah had stopped listening to what others thought was possible the day her husband left, and she had to figure out how to survive. She'd learned to fix her own car, repair her own roof, and work 18-hour days. She could dig up a house. The first week, she barely made any progress. Every evening after Emma came home from school, they'd drive to the property. Sarah would dig, while Emma collected rocks and made up stories about who used to live in the buried house. Her small hands would sometimes help, moving tiny amounts of dirt with a beach bucket Sarah had found at a yard sale. Progress was painfully slow. Sarah's hands got blisters, then got tough and hard. Her back hurt all the time. But every shovel of dirt felt like she was fighting back. The mockery got louder. Photos of her digging showed up on local Facebook groups. Local woman thinks she's a treasure hunter. Someone even made a joke picture of her. But then something unexpected happened. One evening, Emma's teacher, Miss Patricia, showed up with work gloves and her teenage son. Heard you could use some help, she said simply. They dug for 2 hours without talking, moving more dirt than Sarah had moved in 3 days by herself. The next night, 2 more people came, then 5, then a dozen. Not everyone in town was laughing. Some remembered what it was like to have nothing but desperate hope. By the end of the second week, Sarah had a small group of volunteers. Marcus brought a wheelbarrow. The local church youth group made it a service project. Even some of the people who'd made fun of her at first started showing up, curious despite themselves. And then, 23 days after she first started digging, they hit something solid. Sarah was in the hole they'd created, now 6 feet deep, when her shovel rang against metal. She dropped to her knees, brushing dirt away with her bare hands. A copper roof, green from age, but still in one piece. Her heart pounded. "I found it," she screamed. "I found the house!" Emma jumped up and down at the edge of the hole, clapping her hands. The volunteers gathered around, suddenly quiet. It was real. The house was real. Over the next month, digging up the house became the town's unofficial project. The local construction company let them use a big digging machine for a weekend. The fire department pumped out water. Everyone wanted to see what would come out of the ground. What they uncovered was beyond all expectations. The house, built in 1898, had been perfectly saved by the mud that buried it. A fancy Victorian mansion, 3 stories tall with detailed decorative trim, still perfect. The mudslide had hit from an angle, filling the house with mud but not crushing it. It was like a perfectly preserved time capsule. But the real shock came when they finally got the front door open. Sarah went in first, flashlight in hand, Emma close behind. The mud inside had dried and settled over the years, leaving clear space from about waist height to the ceiling. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left. Paintings still hung on the walls. A tea set waited on the dining room table, cups filled with what had long ago been mud but was now just dry dirt. "It's like they just walked away," Sarah whispered. Room by room they explored. The house was fully furnished, decorated with the fancy style of the late 1800s. But in the study, Sarah found something that made her stop breathing. A huge safe built into the wall, still locked. The combination was written in old-fashioned handwriting on a piece of paper in the desk drawer, protected all these years by a glass paperweight placed over it. Sarah's fingers shook as she turned the dial. Click. The safe opened. Inside were stacks of stock certificates. Railroad companies, oil companies, steel companies. Names she recognized from history books. And at the bottom, a leather journal. Sarah opened it carefully. The first page had a name. Cornelius Ashworth, her great-great-grandfather. She'd never even known his name. The journal told the story. Cornelius had been a railroad businessman who'd built this house as a summer home. But in 1924, facing financial ruin from bad investments, he'd made a desperate decision. He'd turned his remaining wealth into stock certificates in companies he believed would survive. Then the mudslide came, burying not just the house, but his last hope of recovery. He died 3 months later, taking the secret with him. Sarah turned to the final entry. "I leave this for whoever is brave enough to dig for it. May they have the courage I lacked to start over." She sat on the dusty floor. Emma curled against her side and called the number on one of the certificates just to see, just to know. The voice on the other end listened to her story, asked for the certificate numbers, and put her on hold. When they came back, they were breathing fast. "Miss Coleman, these certificates, they're still valid. They've been splitting and growing for almost a century. Do you have any idea what these are worth?" Sarah closed her eyes. "Tell me." "At current market value, approximately $15 million. The world went very quiet. Emma looked up at her mother's face. "Mama, are you okay?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Yeah, baby. We're okay. We're finally okay." The news exploded across the town like wildfire. The woman they'd mocked for digging in the dirt had found a fortune. The same people who'd laughed now spoke in hushed, awed tones. But Sarah wasn't thinking about the money yet. She was thinking about the journal entry, about courage, about starting over. She'd been doing both long before she found the safe. The money was just confirmation that sometimes, when you refuse to give up, the universe pays attention. That night, she and Emma slept in the buried house for the first time, in sleeping bags on the cleaned floor of what had once been a grand living room. What happens next will change not just their lives, but their entire town, and remind us all that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not by those who have everything,
but by those brave enough to dig when everyone else says stop. If you're enjoying this story,
please hit the like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. The morning after the discovery, Sarah woke to find 37 messages on her phone. Reporters, lawyers, financial advisors, distant relatives she'd never heard of suddenly remembering she existed. She turned the phone off and made Emma breakfast on a camping stove in the Victorian kitchen. Sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't seen daylight in a century. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Emma asked, syrup dripping down her chin. Sarah wiped it away gently. "First, we're going to finish digging out our house." The excavation had revealed the mansion, but tons of dried mud still filled the lower parts. Sarah could have hired crews now, could have had it done in days. Instead, she kept the volunteers. Every evening, the same people who'd helped when she had nothing showed up with shovels and wheelbarrows. Marcus from the hardware store, Miss Patricia, the church youth group. They worked together, laughing, sharing stories, turning what could have been a lonely change into a community celebration. Sarah hired a local contractor, Bobby Williams, who'd been struggling to keep his small company alive, to oversee the restoration. She paid fair wages to everyone who helped. The economic ripple effect was immediate. Bobby hired more workers. Those workers spent money at local businesses. The dying town began to come back to life, but not everyone was happy about Sarah's good fortune. Thomas Garrett, who owned most of the commercial property in town, showed up one morning in his perfect Mercedes. He'd been Emma's father's friend, the one who'd told him he was crazy to marry someone poor. Now he stood at the entrance to the pit, looking down at Sarah with that same dismissive look. "I hear congratulations are in order," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "Quite a find. Of course, managing that kind of wealth requires experience, education, connections. I'd be happy to help you invest it properly." Sarah kept shoveling. "I'm good, thanks." His smile got tighter. "You sure about that? Small-town single mothers don't usually know how to handle millions. Would be a shame to lose it all to bad decisions." She straightened, meeting his eyes. "You know what I've learned, Mr. Garrett? People who've never been poor make the worst decisions with money. They've never had to make $20 last a week. Never had to choose between gas and groceries. Never learned the value of a single dollar." She started digging again. "I know exactly what this money is worth." He left without another word, but Sarah knew he'd be back. Men like Thomas Garrett didn't give up easily when they smelled opportunity. The restoration revealed wonders daily. A hidden wine cellar with bottles from the 1800s. A library with rare first-edition books. Artwork that had museums calling. But Sarah's favorite discovery was a collection of photographs in a trunk in the attic. Her great-great-grandmother, Constance, had been a photographer, rare for a woman of that time. The images showed the house in its glory, the town as it had been, and something else. In photo after photo, Constance had captured the workers who'd built the railroad, the immigrants who'd laid the tracks, the families who'd made Cornelius Ashworth's fortune possible. Their faces stared out across a century, dignified and strong. Sarah made a decision. She would restore the house, yes, but not as a private mansion, as a museum, a place where the whole story would be told. Not just the wealth, but the work that built it. She hired Dr. Monica Wells, a historian from the State University who specialized in labor history. Together, they began planning exhibits that would honor everyone who'd been part of the story. The town council tried to block her permits. Thomas Garrett led the charge, claiming the museum would disrupt the character of the community. What he really meant was it would remind people where wealth actually came from. Sarah attended every meeting, Emma by her side. She spoke quietly but firmly about her vision, about remembering the forgotten, about sharing history, not hoarding it. The local newspaper editor, Janet Morrison, one of the volunteers who'd helped dig, started running stories about the house's history, about Cornelius Ashworth's workers, about the families whose descendants still lived in town, whose ancestors had built the fortune Sarah had inherited. Public opinion shifted. The permits were approved. Thomas Garrett's influence began to fade. People remembered that he'd inherited his wealth too, and had never shared a penny of it. As the house took shape, so did Sarah's understanding of her inheritance. It wasn't just money, it was responsibility. Her great-great-grandfather had hoarded wealth, buried it literally and figuratively. She would do the opposite. She established the Ashworth Foundation with an initial donation of $5 million. Its mission, to provide scholarships for local students, grants for small businesses, and funding for community projects. The board would be made up of the people who'd helped her dig, the teachers, workers, and volunteers who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. Emma helped choose the Foundation's first project, an after-school program that provided free tutoring and hot meals. Everyone should have help when they need it, she said, wise beyond her 7 years. The House Museum opened exactly 1 year after Sarah had first put shovel to earth. The whole town came. Even Thomas Garrett, though he stood at the edges, watching with narrowed eyes as people streamed through rooms that told stories of workers and wealth, of buried dreams and persistent hope. Sarah stood in the entrance hall, Emma's hand in hers, watching their community explore the space they'd uncovered together. Miss Patricia stopped beside them, eyes bright with tears. "You know what you've done, don't you?" she said. "You didn't just dig up a house. You dug up hope." Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. The blisters had healed, but the calluses remained, proof of work, of refusal to give up. "We all did," she said, together. That night, after everyone had gone home, Sarah and Emma sat on the front steps of their mansion. They still lived in their small apartment in town. Sarah wasn't ready to move into something so grand. Maybe she never would be. But the house lived again, filled with stories and voices and purpose. "Mama," Emma said, leaning against her mother's shoulder. "Are we rich now?" Sarah considered the question. They had money, yes, security, choices, but that wasn't what made them rich. We were rich before, she said finally. When we had nothing but shovels and friends who showed up to help. The money just makes it easier to share. Emma nodded, satisfied with the answer. As the months passed, the Ashworth House Museum became more than just a local attraction. It became a symbol. Universities sent students to study its preservation. Historians came to research the photographs and documents. But mostly people came because they'd heard the story. A single mother, a buried house, a community that chose to help instead of mock, and a fortune that, once uncovered, was used to lift everyone up. Sarah hired locally whenever possible. The museum staff, the maintenance crew, the cafe workers, all were people from town who needed good jobs. She paid well above minimum wage and provided benefits. It's not charity, she explained to a reporter who asked about her business model. It's investment in people, in community. The same investment people made in me when they picked up shovels. But the biggest change wasn't economic. It was in how the town saw itself. No longer dying, no longer forgotten. They had a story now, one that brought visitors, yes, but more importantly reminded them of their own worth. The youth group that had helped dig started a historical society, documenting stories from elderly residents. The high school created an archaeology club. Bobby Williams's construction company expanded, specializing in historical restoration. Other forgotten buildings in town found new life. And Thomas Garrett? He eventually sold his properties and left town, muttering about socialist nonsense and people who don't know their place. His departure opened opportunities for others. Small businesses bloomed where he'd kept rents artificially high. The town quite literally began to breathe. Emma thrived. No more counting pennies for lunch money. No more worry in her mother's eyes. She remained the same caring, thoughtful child, but now with resources to pursue her dreams. I want to be an archaeologist, she announced. Like you, Mama, but with proper tools. Sarah laughed. But she funded a junior archaeologist program at the museum. Emma and her friends learned to properly excavate, document, and preserve. They practiced in a sandbox initially, but Sarah was already looking at other properties. Who knew what else lay buried, waiting for someone patient enough to dig? On the second anniversary of the excavation, the town held a celebration. They called it Digging Day. Everyone brought shovels. Ceremonial now, but symbolic. They gathered at the museum to remember when impossible seemed like the only option, and they chose to dig anyway. Sarah spoke briefly, still uncomfortable with public attention. 2 years ago, people laughed at a desperate woman digging in the dirt. Today we stand in a place that creates jobs, preserves history, and reminds us that nothing stays buried forever. Not houses, not truth, not hope. She paused, looking at the faces around her. Many who'd mocked her now, nodding with respect. Every one of us has something buried. Some dream, some skill, some potential everyone said was worthless. I'm here to tell you, start digging. And if you need help, well, she gestured to the crowd. Look around. We've gotten pretty good at it. The applause was thunderous, but Sarah was already thinking ahead. The foundation had received a letter about another property, another worthless inheritance refused by distant relatives. This time a flooded mine that historical records suggested might contain a forgotten vein of silver. Probably nothing, probably foolish to even consider. Sarah smiled. She'd heard that before. That evening, she found Emma in the museum library, surrounded by maps and geological surveys of the mine property. Mama, look, Emma said excitedly. The water table shifted in 1953. If we could pump it out. Sarah sat beside her daughter, studying the maps. Mother and daughter, planning their next impossible excavation, because Sarah Coleman had learned something in that year of digging. The real treasure wasn't what you found at the bottom. It was discovering you had the strength to keep digging when everyone said stop. It was the people who grabbed shovels and joined you. It was teaching your daughter that impossible was just another word for not yet attempted. And sometimes, yes, it was finding $15 million in stock certificates. But even that paled compared to the fortune of finally knowing your worth, not in dollars, but in determination. As they planned and dreamed, the Ashworth House stood around them, no longer buried, no longer forgotten, a testament to the power of persistence, the value of community, and the truth that sometimes the best things in life require us to get our hands dirty. Outside, the sun set over their small town, painting the sky gold. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new doubts, new voices saying, be reasonable and know your place. But tonight, a mother and daughter dreamed of what else might be waiting underground, and made plans to dig. Sarah Coleman had started with nothing but desperation and a shovel. She'd ended with a fortune, a museum, a transformed town, and the knowledge that she'd never have to count pennies again. But if you asked her the most valuable thing she'd found, She'd tell you it wasn't in that safe. It was in the eyes of her daughter the day Emma realized their life could be different. It was in the faces of neighbors who'd learned to see her differently. It was in her own hands, no longer soft, but strong enough to hold whatever came next. Because Sarah had learned the secret that century of mud had hidden, that the real treasure in life isn't what we inherit, but what we're willing to uncover. And once you start digging, really digging, there's no telling what wonders wait below the surface. 6 months after digging day, Sarah stood in her office at the museum, reviewing applications for the Foundation's latest round of grants. Each one told a story of struggle and hope. Single parents trying to start businesses, students needing scholarship support, elderly residents facing medical bills. She could help them all now, and she did. Emma burst through the door after school, backpack bouncing. "Mama!" "Miss Patricia says the Historical Society found something." Sarah looked up from her papers. "What kind of something?" "Records about great-great-grandma Constance. She didn't just take photographs. She ran an underground railroad station." In our house, Sarah's breath caught. Even now, the house kept revealing secrets. They rushed to the museum's research room where Dr. Monica Wells waited with yellow documents spread across the table. "It's all here," Monica said, eyes bright with discovery. Hidden compartments in the basement walls, a whole network. Constance Ashworth used her husband's wealth and status to hide escaped slaves. She documented everything in code. Sarah traced the faded writing with her finger. Another buried truth. Another story of courage hidden beneath layers of time. "We need to excavate the basement again," she said, carefully. "If those compartments are still there," Monica nodded, "it would be one of the most significant underground railroad discoveries in the state." That weekend, armed with proper archaeological tools this time, they began the delicate work. Emma helped, using the skills she'd learned in her junior archaeologist program. And there, behind what had seemed like solid walls, they found them. Hidden rooms. Cramped spaces where desperate people had waited for freedom. Constance had written names on the walls. Not full names. Too dangerous. But first names and dates. Samuel, April 1859, Mary and son, June 1860, Rebecca. Christmas 1858, dozens of them. Emma stood in one of the tiny rooms, barely large enough for a person to lie down. "They were so brave," she whispered. Sarah put her arm around her daughter. So was Constance. She risked everything. They found journals, too, wrapped in oilcloth. Constance's real journals, not the sanitized ones upstairs. These told the true story. How she'd convinced her husband the basement renovations were for wine storage. How she'd used his business trips to move people through. How she'd photographed some of them. Dangerous evidence she'd hidden away. The photographs survived, protected in a metal box. Faces history had tried to erase stared back across time. Strong, defiant, free. Sarah held one up. A young woman clutching a baby, eyes fierce with determination. "These belong in the museum," Emma said. "Everyone should know." The discovery made national news. The Ashworth House Museum, already respected, became a destination for scholars and families tracing their heritage. Some visitors cried when they saw the photographs, recognizing features passed down through generations. The museum's mission expanded. It wasn't just about the Ashworth fortune anymore. It was about all the hidden histories. The workers who'd built wealth for others. The enslaved who'd sought freedom. The women like Constance who'd risked everything for justice. Sarah hired descendants of the people Constance had helped to work at the museum. Their family stories became part of the permanent exhibition. The hidden rooms were preserved exactly as found, with guided tours that honored the courage of everyone who'd passed through them. Thomas Garrett returned to town briefly, trying to claim the museum was rewriting history and pushing an agenda. At the town council meeting, Sarah stood to respond. "Mr. Garrett, history isn't just what powerful men want remembered. It's everything that happened, the comfortable and the uncomfortable, the celebrated and the hidden." She held up one of Constance's photographs. "This is our history, all of it. And we're not going to bury it again." The council voted unanimously to support the museum's expanded mission. Garrett left town again, this time for good. But the ripples of Sarah's discovery spread far beyond their small town. Other communities began examining their own buried histories. What else had been hidden? What stories had been silenced? Museums across the country reached out, wanting to learn how the Ashworth House had become a model for inclusive historical preservation. Sarah traveled occasionally now, speaking at conferences about community-driven historical projects. But she always returned home quickly. This was where she belonged, where her story had started, where her daughter was growing into a young woman with dirt under her nails and dreams in her heart. On a spring morning, 3 years after the initial discovery, Sarah walked through the museum before it opened. The sunrise painted the rooms golden. and she could almost see the ghosts of all who'd lived here. Cornelius counting his money, Constance planning rescues, the unnamed workers who'd built it all, and now the volunteers who'd helped dig it free. She stopped in the room where the safe had been. It now displayed the original stock certificates alongside the shovel she'd used that first day. A plaque read, "Sometimes the greatest wealth is found not in safes, but in the courage to keep digging." Emma found her there, taller now, more confident, but still the same thoughtful girl who'd helped her mother dig for hope. "Ready for the board meeting?" Emma asked. At 10, she was the youngest member of the Foundation's Youth Advisory Board. Sarah nodded. "What's on your agenda today?" "The new after-school program site. And I want to propose archaeology summer camps for kids who can't afford regular camps." Of course she did. Emma had never forgotten what it felt like to have nothing. The wealth hadn't changed that. It had just given her tools to help others. They walked to the meeting together, mother and daughter, through rooms that had once been buried but now blazed with light and life. The morning sun caught the copper roof, still green with age but polished now, a beacon visible for miles. People drove from neighboring states just to see it, to hear the story, to be reminded that impossible was just another kind of dirt waiting to be moved. The bell above the museum door chimed as the first visitors arrived. Sarah greeted them as she always did, with dirty hands and a genuine smile, because she was still digging not into earth anymore, but into possibilities, into potential, into all the buried dreams waiting to be discovered. The Coleman Foundation had given away $7 million so far. The museum employed 30 people full-time. The town that had once been dying now thrived, with new businesses and young families moving in, all because one desperate woman had decided to dig when everyone said not to. But if you asked Sarah about her greatest accomplishment, she'd point to the wall of photos in the museum's entrance. Pictures sent by people inspired by her story. A man in Idaho excavating his grandmother's buried greenhouse. Teenagers in Detroit uncovering a community garden. A woman in Maine literally digging out her great-grandfather's shipwreck. All of them holding shovels. All of them smiling through the dirt and sweat. All of them refusing to leave their dreams buried. "That's the real treasure," Sarah would say. "Not what I found, but what I started." As the museum filled with voices and footsteps, Sarah took her place at the information desk. She still worked regular shifts, answering questions, sharing the story, reminding anyone who'd listened that the only thing standing between them and their own buried treasure was the willingness to pick up a shovel and start. Because Sarah Coleman knew something most people forgot. Every fortune, every discovery, every transformation began the same way, with dirty hands, with aching backs, with voices saying impossible, and with one person brave enough to dig anyway. The $15 million had been life-changing, yes, but the real value of Sarah's inheritance wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the lives transformed, the history reclaimed, the community reborn. It was measured in a daughter who'd learned that persistence could move mountains, or at least the dirt covering buried houses. And it was measured in the simple, powerful truth that Sarah Coleman had proven with every shovel full of earth, that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't hidden by accident. They're buried by those who don't want us to know our own worth. But once we start digging, once we refuse to stop, there's no telling what miracles wait beneath our feet. All it takes is a shovel and the courage to use it. The story of the woman who inherited dirt and found $15 million became legend. But the real story, the one Sarah told every visitor, was simpler. I was broke. I was desperate. I was alone, but I wasn't afraid of hard work. And it turns out, that's worth more than all the money in any safe. So if you're standing at the edge of your own buried house, wondering if it's worth the effort, wondering if everyone's right and you're wrong, let me tell you something. Pick up the shovel. Start digging. You might not find millions, but you'll find something worth even more. You'll find out what you're made of. And trust me, that's treasure enough. As Sarah Coleman stood in her museum, surrounded by the fruits of her labor and the community she'd helped rebuild, she knew one thing for certain. The best inheritance isn't what someone leaves you. It's what you're willing to uncover. And sometimes, just sometimes, when you dig deep enough, you don't just change your own life. You transform the world around you. One shovel full at a time. Anyone can find treasure if they're willing to get their hands dirty and keep digging when everyone else says stop. As the years passed, Sarah Coleman's story echoed far beyond the small town she'd helped bring back to life. The single mother who'd inherited mockery and dirt had become a symbol of what's possible when we refuse to accept that buried means gone forever. And the museum she'd built from mud and dreams now trained archaeologists and historians. The foundation she'd established had given away $12 million, funding educations, saving homes, launching businesses. But perhaps the greatest legacy was simpler. In a world that so often told people like her, single mothers, working poor, the overlooked and underestimated, to accept their lot. Sarah had picked up a shovel and proved that sometimes the only thing standing between us and transformation is the willingness to dig. The woman, who'd once counted 2347, now counted the faces of children learning their history, families finding their roots, and dreamers discovering their courage. Because Sarah Coleman had learned the ultimate truth. We all have something buried. Dreams, potential, history, hope. The only question is whether we're brave enough to bring it to light. And in a small town in North Carolina, where a Victorian mansion stood as testament to the power of persistence, the answer rang out clear as a bell. Yes, yes, we are. The end. Up next, 2 powerful stories that will restore your faith in the impossible. Click now to discover more incredible true tales. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe every buried dream deserves to see daylight.